US, we send a lot of people to jail. Something like 11 million people pass through our local jails every year. This means that as a society, we're doing a sort of balancing act where we're implicitly weighing the perceived social benefits of these jail terms against the social and the individual costs that we see. What does jail time mean for someone's job prospect, for their family, for their engagement in the community, and so on? My work as a political scientist aims to measure another effect of jail sentencing, and that's on political participation. I've been asking whether sending people to jail, even for short periods for relatively minor crimes, can make them less likely to vote in future elections. And further, I've been asking whether jail matters differently across race, given the very different incarceration rates we see for white and non-white Americans. Now, I'm not talking here about people who have been legally disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. I'm talking about people who have spent a few days or weeks behind bars over a misdemeanor crime, something like drug possession or shoplifting, and who then stop voting either because their view of government has been dramatically changed by the experience, or because their life circumstances have been so changed that voting falls by the wayside. So I've been asking how often people stop voting because of these short jail terms. But how do you study something like that? We could start by comparing voting rates among people who have been to jail and those who haven't. But you might already be thinking, people who get sent to jail differ from those who don't in a variety of ways, right? So how do we know that jail is what's causing the difference in voting rates and not education or income or any number of other things? And social scientists have tools to deal with problems like this. If we want to know whether a particular campaign flyer works, for example, to get people to vote, we can run an experiment. We can randomly assign some households to receive a flyer in the mail and others not. And then we can see whether these otherwise comparable groups behave differently in the next election. We can see whether the flyer worked. But in cases where we can't run actual experiments, sometimes we have to get creative and look for a natural variation out in the world. That's what I've done here. I focus on one county with a particular court structure. In this case, people who are charged with misdemeanor crimes are randomly assigned to one of 15 different courtrooms that could hear their case. And these courtrooms and the judges that sit within them differ a lot in how often they sentence people to jail. This means that if two identical people walked into the courthouse on the same day, charged with the same thing, but they got sent to different courtrooms, one of them could conceivably walk free while the other one gets sent to jail simply because of this assignment mechanism. So you see how this feels a little bit like the experiment I just mentioned, right? There's a part of people's jail sentencing that's being driven not by their personal characteristics, but by chance, by the luck of the draw. And this is surprising and it's interesting on its own, but it's also going to help me answer the question of how jail affects voting, because now there's this random component to jail sentencing that I can use kind of like experimental data. So once we've worked out this research design, what do we find? Well, going to jail does make people less likely to vote. I find about a 4 percentage point drop overall. But it's not the same across the board. White defendants show no demobilization. They keep voting at the same rates, regardless of jail sentences. But black defendants who are sent to jail become 13 percentage points less likely to vote. Think of moving from 24% voter turnout down to just 11% of people voting. And this translates into thousands of black voters staying home from the polls in just this county in a given election year. But why do we see these stark differences in the effect of jail on voting? Well, at least partly because of differences in who gets arrested and charged with these kinds of crimes in the first place. When I look back at public records, I find that white defendants in these courtrooms were generally not voting even before they were arrested. Only a very small proportion of them had voted in the last presidential election, for example. And if you weren't voting before you went to jail, there's not a lot of room to stop voting afterwards. So we don't see an effect here. There's no demobilization happening. But there's also a lot of evidence, when we look at black defendants, that African Americans disproportionately face police scrutiny and risk of arrest. And so, with more people being arrested, come more and different people being pulled into the courtrooms. And with more voters in the courtroom, which is one thing that we see, Black defendants were nearly twice as likely as white defendants to have been voters before they got arrested. They had voted at almost twice the rate in the last election. With more voters in the courtroom come more opportunity to stop voting after you've been sent to jail. So there's much more room to see this big demobilization effect. So you've seen that jail can deter people from voting, and that it disproportionately discourages Black voters from going to the polls. And this is an important story at the individual level. But at the neighborhood level, it could be even more politically significant, because we know that arrests and jail sentences aren't evenly distributed across geographic areas. They're clustered. And so if people are leaving the electorate due to jail, this will translate into lower voter turnout in some neighborhoods, disproportionately in minority neighborhoods. And ultimately, this could mean that the neighborhoods that are most directly affected by our current criminal justice policies are also the least likely to have politicians' attention when it comes to setting those policies going forward. Incarceration could be building a cycle of community disenfranchisement. Thank you.